In this lesson, I'm going to talk about 8 techniques that help you write cleaner and more maintainable CSS. The first one is follow a naming convention consistently. This is one of the major problems I see in web development projects. Different people have joined a team and they have brought their favorite naming convention. So there is no standard in the team. Everyone follows their own convention and the entire project has turned into a mess. So let me quickly walk you through a few naming conventions. Let's say we have an element with a class of navbar. We can call that class nav-bar. This is called kebab case. So with kebab case, we separate multiple words using a hyphen. Another common convention is camel case. With camel case, the first letter of the first word should be lowercase, but the first letter of every word after should be uppercase. So this is camel case. Another common convention is Pascal case. With Pascal case, the first letter of every word should be uppercase. And of course, there is another convention where people separate multiple words using an underscore. Whatever you like, make sure to stick to it. Define a guideline for the entire team to follow. So that's number 1. Number 2 is create logical sections in your style sheet. For small projects, you might have a single style sheet. For larger projects, you want to split that style sheet into multiple style sheets and then combine them together. This is where we use CSS preprocessor tools like Sass and less. I'm going to create a course on this topic in the future. So for a small project with a single style sheet, you don't want to write all your styles in one place. You want to logically separate them in different containers. For example, on the top, we can have basic styles. This is where we define rules such as box sizing. We set it to border box. We can also define rules for our HTML and body elements. Then below that, we can have another section for topography. This is where we define styles for H1, H2, H3, and so on. Then we can have another section for our forms. So we can have various classes for styling different types of input fields. After that, we can have a section for our navigation bar and so on. So adding these comments help us logically separate different sections in our style sheet. Once again, for a large project, you really want to split this file into multiple files and then combine them as part of your build process. Third, avoid over-specific selectors. This is the most common problem I see amongst various front-end developers. So let's say we want to have a div with the class of nav. Inside this div, we want to have a UL with the class of items. And inside this UL, we want to have 3 list items. So li times 3. Now, let's add some text. Link 1, link 2, and link 3. Good. Now, to style these list items, some people write a selector like this. We have a div with the class of nav. Inside this div, we have a UL with the class of items. And here we have a bunch of list items. Now, this selector is overly specific and becomes hard to maintain over time. As you write more selectors like this, you'll end up with a lot of important keywords and your styles will not behave the way you expect. So let's look at the specificity of this selector. We hover our mouse over here. Look, the specificity is 23. We talked about this in the first part of the series. So we have 2 class selectors and 3 element selectors. Now let me show you how we can reduce the specificity and make this rule more relaxed. The first thing I want to do is to remove these direct child selectors because our rule knows too much about our markup structure. What if tomorrow we come back here and decide to wrap this UL inside another container like a div? Then our rule is going to break because the UL element will no longer be a direct child of this div element, right? So let's remove these direct child selectors. And by the way, that doesn't mean that we should never use direct child selectors, but as much as possible, we should avoid them to make our selectors more relaxed. Okay? Now, the second problem is that our rule knows about the type of our HTML elements. So it knows that we have a div with the class of nav. What if tomorrow I decide to change the type of this element to nav? Then our rule is going to break. So to prevent this from happening, we should remove the type of HTML elements. Now, what about the list item? Well, we can give these items a class like item, and then it doesn't matter if we use a list item or another type of element in the future. So back to our markup, let me show you a cool trick. So I put the cursor here. Now on the top, we go to the selection menu. Look at the shortcut for this command. add cursor below. On Mac, it's Alt, Command, and down. If you press these keys, we can add multiple cursors in the same column. So now we can type class equals item, all in one go. Good. Now back to our rule. Can we make this even simpler? Of course we can. We don't really need this second selector here. As long as we have an element with the class of item inside our nav, our rule is going to work. So the second part is unnecessary. Now, there's a problem with rules like this. What if we have a rule for the item class somewhere else? So over here, let's say we have a general rule for elements with this class. And here we set the background to yellow. Now, save the changes. As you can see, all our menu items now have a yellow background. But what if we don't want this yellow background in our navigation bar? Then we'll have to come back here and set background to none. That solves the problem, but writing code like this is ugly. Constantly, we have to undo styles applied somewhere else. Now, what if someone has used the important keyword here? Then the yellow background is back. So once again, we have to use the important keyword over here. See the problem? So how can we prevent this from happening? Well, the reason we're experiencing this issue is because the style we have defined here has leaked into this component, into the navigation bar component. To prevent this from happening, we can use a prefix over here. So with this, we're representing an item inside our navigation component. So back to our markup, let's select all these classes and prefix them. Good. Now back to our style sheet. We don't have to undo the background anymore, and the problem is gone. Now back to our style sheet, I would argue that we don't even need to use nesting here because we have used a prefix. So whether we add the nav class here or not, it doesn't matter because we're not going to use this class outside of our navigation bar, right? Now look at the specificity of this selector. It's 10. Initially we had 32 or 23, I don't remember exactly, but we reduced that to 10. So this is how we can write clean, maintainable selectors. Now the fourth best practice, avoid the important keyword. Avoid it as much as possible. If you're using the important keyword, that means you have done something wrong somewhere else. Most likely, you have written an overly specific selector. Next, while not compulsory, it's a good practice to sort CSS properties. So let's say we have these styles for our navigation items. As you can see, these properties are not sorted. This makes it hard to read them. So here we can select all these properties. Then we bring up the command palette and search for sort. We have sort lines ascending. Boom. Simple as that. Next, take advantage of style inheritance. So back to our navigation item. Here we can set the font family to the system font stack. And here's what we get. But what if we go back to our markup and inside this navigation bar, we add an anchor with a class of brand. Let's say my website. So this brand is styled differently. Now we can come back here and give that element a class like nav-brand and repeat the font family property here. This is a terrible practice. What we need to do here is to apply this style on the parent element, which is the nav element. So on the top, if we use nav, then we remove this. Now, all these elements are inheriting the same style. All right, what's next? Extract repetitive patterns in your style sheet. This is part of a larger discussion called object-oriented CSS, which we're going to talk about shortly. And finally, avoid repetitive values in your code. We talked about the dry principle before. Don't repeat yourself. So next, I will show you how to use CSS variables to avoid repetition in your code.